Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Taoist Heavenspan had perished. Back in the Heavenspan realm, his spectacular talent, his immense power, and his profound scheming had brought ruin to Arch-Emperor City. He very nearly ended the succession of the Arch-Emperors and brought about the existence of the Wildlands. In the end, he personally destroyed the Heavenspan realm. Now, his life was nothing but a thing of the past. He was now ash drifting in the starry sky, his soul gone forever. No one had heard his final words, and no one would ever know whether he thought it had all been worth it, or not. No one would ever know what would have happened if the Gravekeeper had violated the ancient stipulations, and actually allowed Taoist Heavenspan to lead the Arch-Emperor dynasty. The Gravekeeper had adhered to the Arch-Ancestors' wishes, and did not allow someone who lacked the Taoist magics of the Arch-Emperors to lead the exodus from the Heavenspan realm. Taoist Heavenspan had lived a thrilling life, but all of his ruthless ambitions had now come to an end. Mixed emotions could be seen in the eyes of both Song Ke and the Saint Emperor as they watched the ash that was all that remained of Taoist Heavenspan drifting out into the void. As for all the other living beings in the eternal immortal domains, especially the cultivators of the Arch-Emperor dynasty, they were completely stunned by the battle which had just taken place. Although they couldn't see everything clearly, they could sense that Taoist Heavenspan was dead, and after a short moment of silence, they broke out into cheering. They all hated Taoist Heavenspan with a passion, and as their cheers filled the air, Song Ke and the Saint Emperor prepared to return to the eternal immortal domains. But then, both of their expressions flickered. A boundless, majestic aura suddenly appeared, something that could fill the entire starry sky and cause pressure to weigh down on all living beings. Both within and without the starry sky, it was the ultimate expression of existence, and it came from none other than the enormous, statue-like mortal Renegade. The sky trembled, and the eternal immortal domains shook, causing crevices to open up everywhere. Even the eternal sea was affected, and began to sink down due to the invisible force. Everyone in the eternal immortal domains felt struck to the core, and began to shiver, all the way down to their souls. It was as if their thoughts and minds had been wiped away, leaving them capable of feeling only instinctual terror and confusion. It was as if they were suddenly in the presence of the most deadly and vicious enemy possible. If that were all there were to the situation, it might not have been a big deal. But strangely, the aura seemed to contain the power of natural law, some sort of force of attraction which caused the previously sinking waters of the eternal sea to suddenly begin to rise up into the air. It wasn't just the eternal sea. Mountains were ripped out of the ground and began to float up, and even people. Regardless of the level of their cultivation base, they all began to rise into the air, their bodies completely beyond their own control. Cities, palaces, plants, vegetation, animals. Everything in the eternal immortal domains seemed to be affected. It was a completely shocking scene. Even Bai Xiaochun began to rise up into the air, along with his private chamber. No protective spell formations had any effect. Shockingly, even the door of his chamber was affected, and shattered, with the resulting fragments slowly floating up. Now it was possible to see Bai Xiaochun, sitting there cross-legged, withered and brittle. It was impossible to tell whether he was alive or dead. He was being affected like everything else in the eternal immortal domains, except for the fact that he sat there cross-legged and unmoving. Bai Xiaochun was the only one to react in such a way. Even the Saint Emperor and Song Ke were trembling, as though fetters had suddenly wrapped around them. With immense difficulty, they turned and looked behind them to see the mortal Renegade, moving. As he hovered there in the starry sky, his hands twitched, and then cracking sounds rang out from his head. At the same time, the dirt and rock that had built up on him over the many years began to crack. First there were dozens of cracks, then hundreds, and soon thousands. Within moments, there were tens of thousands, and with each new one that appeared, his aura grew more shocking. The living beings in the eternal immortal domains could hardly think, and in fact, the lands also seemed to be moving upward, albeit very slowly. As for the Saint Emperor and Song Ke, they were completely overwhelmed by waves of shock. The Saint Emperor said shakily, terror shining in his eyes as he watched the cracks spreading out over the surface of the mortal Renegade. Song Ke's face was ashen. Both he and the Saint Emperor had gone all out in their fight with Taoist Heavenspan, and although they had killed him in the end, their battle had only served to reinforce how unimaginably powerful the mortal Renegade was. He's waking up, ahead of schedule. In that moment, the mortal Renegade's eyelids twitched, causing massive rumbling sounds to echo out. From the dirt and rocks that were now falling down, it was obvious that the mortal Renegade was trying to open his eyes. As for the sealing strip on him that represented the Arch-Emperor, it only took a few short breaths of time for it to vanish completely. It sounded like a zither string snapping, a sound which filled all of the eternal immortal domains. And then, for the first time since he had been sealed, the mortal renegade's eyelids cracked open, revealing something like two suns. When those suns appeared in the dark starry sky, they did not shine with blinding light. No, these suns were black, and actually resembled black holes. And those black holes were none other than the eyes of the mortal renegade. The mortal renegade was waking up. In that moment, the sound of a sigh could be heard, seemingly originating from the most ancient of times. It echoed out to fill all creation, filling the starry sky, and even the ruins that were all that remained of the countless living beings that had once existed. In response to that sigh, the minds of all living beings in the eternal immortal domains reeled, and they immediately snapped out of their reveries. Not even paying attention to how they were now floating up into the air, they all looked up into the sky, at the mortal renegade's eyes. There were no cries of alarm, but there were innumerable gasps, as a sense of profound terror and helplessness filled them all. Then, a voice spoke, profoundly ancient, thrumming as if with the essence of time, causing everything it reached to age. I have awakened for one reason. Extermination. In that instant, the eternal immortal domains suddenly began to turn gray. By now, the mortal renegade was completely covered with innumerable cracks. Then, rumbling sounds echoed out as he began his first attempt to move. As the mortal renegade woke up, causing rocks and rubble to rain down off of him, Bai Xiaochun remained cross-legged, seemingly unaffected. He was withered, his aura apparently dispersed, his eyes closed and his hair floating around him. It was impossible to tell whether he was alive or dead, although there was something profoundly mysterious about him. For some reason, it seemed that what was sitting there cross-legged was not a human body, but some sort of god. Out in the starry sky, the ruins where the dandelion seeds had settled were all undergoing shocking transformations. The glow rising up from them grew stronger, driving away the darkness, and causing life force to flourish, as well as radiance and light. Spots of light filled the void, seemingly awakening it, causing it to be reborn out of nirvanic extermination. Before, there had been a pitch-black void, but that was changing. Now, an astounding will seemed to thrum everywhere. That will cause the darkness to tremble, to begin fighting an epic battle with the radiance and light. If one could look at that starry sky from high above, it would actually look like an ordinary night sky. Countless points of light glittered, letting off glows that, while weak, grew powerful as they joined together. The darkness within the starry sky did not seem willing to be driven away, and tried to inundate the ruins with more darkness. However, that resistance was apparently instinctual, and was not driven by intelligence. Nirvanic extermination fought with life force in every nook and cranny of the starry sky. Even stranger, as the light in all of the ruins grew stronger, Bai Xiaochun seemed to become more and more abstruse, and seem more and more like a shocking god. Although the mortal renegade was waking up ahead of schedule, Bai Xiaochun had been at work for years, and had already built a very solid foundation. By now, more than half of the ruins in the starry sky were shining with bright light. Unfortunately, he had only accomplished that because the mortal renegade had been asleep, and unable to oppose him. Now, the mortal renegade was waking up, and while the darkness had only fought back instinctually before, it now seemed to come to life. The starry sky trembled as though it were aware, and the darkness began to resist Bai Xiaochun, and at the same time, attempt to overwhelm the ruins that were already shining with light. The ruins which had not already been lit up were now under assault, and were already teetering on the verge of failure. As for those which had been lit up already, they were now being battered at madly by the darkness, but still managed to hold their own. It almost seemed like a stalemate, with Bai Xiaochun preventing the darkness from taking over again, but unable to light up more ruins. No one could see what was happening, not even Bai Xiaochun. At the moment, he didn't possess his senses, and was acting on instinct alone. Unfortunately, he was now stuck, and couldn't continue his work. Meanwhile, in the ruins closest to the immortal world, there existed a shining dandelion seed. Gradually, the light shining out of that dandelion seed twisted and distorted, transforming into the shape of a person. It was someone seated cross-legged in meditation, and soon, his facial features became clear. It was Bai Xiaochun. It looked like a clone, but at the same time, not a clone. He contained a Tao and life force, and even essence power. No one could see him, but if anyone could, they would have no way to tell whether or not he was the real Bai Xiaochun. And the truth was that he was actually a Tao clone. It was something Bai Xiaochun was doing instinctively as he identified his Tao. Even as that happened, the mortal renegade woke up, making it impossible for Bai Xiaochun to continue illuminating the starry sky. Therefore, he shifted to a different tactic. Instead of spreading further, he would use the 50% control that he had to become a sovereign. As soon as his Dao clone appeared, the light shining from that set of ruins grew vastly more intense. The darkness in the area was driven away, provoking a howl of rage. However, there was nothing the darkness could do. In the same moment that Bai Xiaochun's first Dao clone appeared, the mortal renegade's eyes began to shine brightly, and his body trembled more violently. Vast swaths of rock and dirt fell off of him, becoming meteorites that rained down onto the eternal immortal domains. Even the people in the eternal immortal domains could sense how anxious the mortal renegade was in his moment. "He's nervous?" Song Ke said. The Saint Emperor could sense the same thing. They exchanged an excited glance, and then looked down at the only person in the eternal immortal domains who was calm and sitting there cross-legged. Bai Xiaochun. As Bai Xiaochun's Dao clone formed, the mysterious aura surrounding his true self expanded to fill the entire 300-meter area surrounding him. Within that area, the shattered lands began to form back together and brim with life force. Even more shocking to Song Ke and the Saint Emperor was the fact that Bai Xiaochun was now radiating the sensation of essence. Before long, the dandelions in a second set of nearby ruins, and then a third, began to shine brightly as two more Dao clones formed. As they did, they shone with such bright light that the starry sky was transformed, causing all the living beings in the eternal immortal domains to look up. In that moment when the light blazed, the enormous mortal renegade looked up, and then spoke in a voice that shook the souls of everyone alive. "Well, isn't this interesting?" It was a cold, ancient voice, and as it spoke, his entire body suddenly moved. As a result, the heavens shook, and endless streams of rock and dirt exploded off of him. As of this moment, the mortal renegade was completely and utterly free from any sealing magics. He was a giant, floating in the starry sky, with the eternal immortal domains in front of him, like a toy ball that a child might play with. As for the people upon it, they were nothing more than insects. Everyone in the eternal immortal domains trembled in anxiety, their minds struck with fear and terror. Before, some of them had hoped that they would somehow be able to escape after the mortal renegade awoke. But now that he was actually awake, they all knew that escape was impossible. All confidence left them as they stared up blankly at the mortal renegade, whose right hand was already moving toward the eternal immortal domains as if to grab them. His hand alone was roughly as big as all of the eternal immortal domains, and its mere movement seemed capable of collapsing the sky. "I brought nirvanic extermination to all 180,000 worlds, and thus gave birth to the eternal flower. And today, I will take that flower and become eternal." The mortal renegade's voice shook the starry sky. Apparently, it also contained his Dao, which was to exterminate anything and everything in existence. The areas of the starry sky that Bai Xiaochun had occupied were also shaken, and at the same time, darkness spread out like floodwaters. The mortal renegade's hand seemed to fill the sky as it neared the seemingly doomed eternal immortal domains. It was a critical moment in which all living beings could only look on in shock, trembling. Song Ke and the Saint Emperor were panting. Although they were half-sovereigns who weren't as badly affected as everyone else, they were still struggling simply to react. Blue veins bulged out on Song Ke's face and neck as he looked up at the enormous, pitch-black hand that already threatened to destroy the sky. As the lands below shook, and as the eternal immortal domains hovered on the verge of collapse, he let out a roar of rage. Throwing all caution to the wind, and ignoring the fact that the pressure was already threatening to destroy him, he once again ignited himself and shot up to meet the gigantic hand. As for the Saint Emperor, he chuckled bitterly, then ignited himself as well, and shot after Song Ke with just as much determination. They seemed like nothing when compared to the enormous hand, and yet, they still chose to fight back. This tragic and moving scene was not visible to the living beings below. However, the eternal immortal domains had a spirit, that being the eternal mother, and although she was weak, she could still see what was happening. A sensation of grief spread out from all living things, even the plants and vegetation, as Song Ke and the Saint Emperor closed in on the hand of the mortal renegade. Both of them were roaring at the tops of their lungs, dazzling light shining off of them in all directions. Unfortunately, even after igniting themselves, they still could not stop that hand. They could attack with all the might they could muster, and yet, it would do nothing to delay the moment in which the mortal renegade's hand arrived. Rumbling booms could be heard as blood sprayed out of Song Ke's mouth. He tumbled down, body on the verge of collapsing. It was the same with the Saint Emperor, who was now covered with bloody wounds, half of his body crushed to a pulp, and barely conscious. Thankfully, the aura of the Eternal Mother had already extended a measure of protection to them, otherwise, they would have been killed instantly. Song Ke was still aware of what was happening, and he chuckled bitterly. He glanced up despairingly at the mortal renegade, and then over at Bai Xiaochun, who was still sitting there cross-legged. Unfortunately, Song Ke was too weak to do anything other than stand by as the enormous hand grew larger and larger in the sky. He could well imagine what would happen if the mortal renegade's hand was not stopped. The people of the eternal immortal domains would die, and then the lands would be shattered. In the end, the mortal renegade would absorb the ruins of the eternal immortal domains, and then reach his goal of becoming eternal. Is this the end of it all? Song Ke murmured, grief welling up inside of him. At that point, he simply closed his eyes. And yet, it was in that exact moment that Bai Xiaochun's eyelids twitched, and a shocking aura erupted out from inside of him. His aura had only spread out for 300 meters before, but now it extended to 30,000 meters. And without even a slight pause, it reached 300,000 meters and then 3 million. Bai Xiaochun's aura, as well as his essence power, rippled out, joined by the fluctuations of a sovereign. That sovereign aura was like a drop of water flung into a vat of boiling oil. Intense rumbling sounds echoed out, and even as the mortal renegade's hand approached, Bai Xiaochun's aura became like a glowing shield that spread out in the sky. It covered the living people, the Arch-Emperor dynasty, the 5 immortal domains, and all creation. And then, it made contact with the mortal renegade's hand. As the deafening sound of the impact filled all creation, Song Ke's eyes snapped open. He had sensed how Bai Xiaochun had placed a protective covering over the living beings in the eternal immortal domains, and could now see the bright light shining off of him. It's the Arch-Emperor. The Arch-Emperor is out of seclusion. Xiaochun, Daddy. Countless cries of shock and joy filled the lands. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun slowly rose to his feet, his withered state rapidly fading away. Then, he lifted his head, and opened his eyes. As he did, a droning sound filled the eternal immortal domains and the starry sky, a sound that everyone could hear, but whose nature they could not determine. All of the ruins out in the starry sky also thrummed with it, almost as if they contained countless natural and magical laws. The 50% of the ruins in the starry sky that Bai Xiaochun controlled shone with blinding light that soon combined, driving the darkness away from those areas. Even the Dao clones began to thrum with the same sound. However, the origin of the sound was none other than Bai Xiaochun's true self, standing there in the eternal immortal domains. His eyes no longer contained irises and pupils, but rather, shone with a brightness that could look down on anything and everything in existence. The aura of a sovereign swirled around him, causing winds to scream, and shaking half of the starry sky. The mortal renegade's Tao was one of ultimate destruction, of nirvanic extermination. He wished to extinguish all light in the starry sky, and cast everything into complete darkness. A Tao like that did not require the approval of any world. And in fact, no world even qualified to approve of it. It was a Tao which could propel someone into being the most powerful type of sovereign. It was the same with Bai Xiaochun. His Tao woke life. He had scattered Dao seeds throughout the lifeless void, and then formed Dao clones whose light slowly illuminated the starry sky. His Tao did not require the approval of any world, and in fact, there was no world that could qualify to offer approval. This was the most powerful type of Tao. When he broke out of the Archean realm and entered the sovereign realm, he was destined to become just like the mortal renegade, the most powerful type of sovereign. Mortal renegade. Bai Xiaochun did not focus his gaze on the enormous hand being blocked by the shield he had created. Instead, he looked further out into the starry sky, at the mortal renegade himself, who was looking down on him with a strange gleam in his eyes. Their gazes locked for a moment as Bai Xiaochun finished rising to his feet. Then, he erupted with explosive energy and a shocking, powerful aura. At that point, the mortal renegade's hand, which was still touching the shield he had created, was struck, and forced backward. The Tao of radiance and light, the mortal renegade growled. Although his eyes were like black holes, they still managed to flicker as cold as ice. After his hand was shoved back by the backlash attack, it began to glow with a darkness reminiscent of midnight, and then descended once again. It now pulsed with even greater power than before, causing everything around it to collapse. The living creatures in the eternal immortal domains all coughed up blood, and many of the mountains which had been floating up into the air shattered. Terrifying fluctuations rolled out that seemed capable of destroying anything and everything, and seemed just on the verge of completely overwhelming the eternal immortal domains. However, after Bai Xiaochun rose to his feet, he began to fly upward in a blur. At that point, the terrifying fluctuations finally seemed to meet their match, and were incapable of advancing any further. They even began to shrink back a bit. Moments later, Bai Xiaochun appeared high in the sky, right beneath the mortal renegade's hand. He was so small compared to the hand that he almost wasn't visible, and yet, his aura could shake heaven and earth. Although he was tiny, to everyone present, he definitely seemed powerful enough to dominate that enormous hand. The instant Bai Xiaochun appeared, he clenched his right hand into a fist, and focused his aura. Right now, his thoughts were completely clear. He was a sovereign now, although that brought him no joy. He was only focused on one thing. No matter what it takes, I will defeat you. A sovereign aura erupted out from his fist, and at the same time, a shadowy figure appeared behind him. Bai Xiaochun was utilizing his undying sovereign's fist. In the past, it had always been something of a misnomer to call it the undying sovereign's fist. But now, he was a sovereign, and therefore, this fist strike was so much more powerful than before that not even he was sure how to calculate it. All he knew was that it could stop the mortal renegade's hand from descending. It was a confidence that seemed to be born from the fact that he was now a sovereign. As the fist struck, the figure behind Bai Xiaochun, which was large enough to prop up heaven and earth, also struck out. The resulting fist strike was roughly the same size as the mortal renegade's palm. One above, one below, flying forth, to strike each other. Strictly speaking, this was actually the first blow to be struck between Bai Xiaochun and the mortal renegade. A massive boom rang out, and the starry sky seemed to crack and split. A massive shockwave rolled out, distorting the air, and causing everything to tremble. The eternal immortal domains were shaken, but Bai Xiaochun was there to protect them, and bore the brunt of the force. Despite being a sovereign, and despite having the powers of regeneration from the Undying Codex, he still coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. As for the eternal immortal domains, they shook, and many mountains crumbled, but they were kept safe overall. Furthermore, the force of the impact actually caused them to start floating away from the battle. That was exactly the result Bai Xiaochun had hoped for. As for the mortal renegade, his hand trembled from the impact, and his eyes flickered. Ignoring the eternal immortal domains as they drifted away, he focused all of his divine sense directly onto Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun stared right back at him, completely unfazed by his enormous size. Now that Bai Xiaochun was a sovereign, he knew that if he wanted to, he could also grow to a similar size. Unfortunately, he also knew that he was not a match for the mortal renegade right now. Although he controlled 50% of the starry sky, so did the mortal renegade. And the mortal renegade had existed for too many years to count. Therefore, there was only one option for him in this fight. I need to take control of more of the starry sky. I need more ruins to shine with light, and I need more Dao clones. Bai Xiaochun knew that this was the only viable tactic. As soon as he had become a sovereign, he had sensed that there was something very mysterious and even unfathomable about this starry sky. Whatever it was the foundation of everything here, and although he could sense it, he couldn't touch it. However, with every Dao clone he added, and the brighter the ruins shone, the clearer it became. After the sovereign realm is the eternal realm. Whatever mysterious and unfathomable thing I can sense everywhere, could it possibly be the path leading to the eternal? There was one thing he was certain of. Consuming the eternal immortal domains to become eternal was only one path, and he would not choose that one. At this point, the mortal renegade spoke. It's been a long time since I've met someone who could stand up to my palm strike. As far as he was concerned, it didn't matter that the eternal immortal domains were slipping away. He could catch up to them whenever he wanted. However, Bai Xiaochun's presence put him in a state of unease that he did his best to keep hidden. After all, the way Bai Xiaochun had become a sovereign, fundamentally plundered from the mortal renegade, driving away the darkness of his will. Obviously, that was a major threat to him. My battleship is missing its main banner. Once I bless you with nirvanic extermination, I'll use your soul to craft the missing piece. With that, the mortal renegade extended his hand, not to perform an incantation gesture, but to point at Bai Xiaochun. World entombment, he said, his ancient voice echoing out into the starry sky. All of a sudden, the void in front of Bai Xiaochun distorted, and 9 statues materialized. Each was 30,000 meters tall, and radiated an indescribable aura of death and nirvanic extermination. In fact, as Bai Xiaochun looked at them, he realized that they weren't really 9 statues, but rather, 9 enormous worlds, just like the eternal lands. Apparently, these were 9 enormous worlds that had once existed within the starry sky. Yet again, the mortal renegade spoke. The eternal world, or should I call it the eternal domain, was once the center of 9 starry skies, the 9 great worlds. Once upon a time, I wiped those 9 worlds out of existence. Only then did I come to bring nirvanic extermination to this place. Although the mortal renegade did not speak in a loud voice, it was still powerful enough to shake the entire starry sky. Even as the words left his mouth, those 9 huge statues began to shine with black light, creating 9 enormous vortexes that then shot toward Bai Xiaochun. Within the vortexes were countless devilish specters, howling madly as they tried to climb out to devour Bai Xiaochun. Each of the statues radiated pressure equivalent to a sovereign, or perhaps even beyond that level, a force that caused Bai Xiaochun's expression to flicker. So, Bai Xiaochun thought, in addition to the eternal world, there used to be 9 other great worlds. It was a fact Bai Xiaochun had never been made aware of, not even in the memories of the worldly Taoist. These 9 statues, each one containing destructive power similar to the eternal world, were a divine ability that Bai Xiaochun had never heard of before. He had just become a sovereign, and although he had fought other sovereigns in the past, those foes had always been weak soul projections. As such, he had never been too sure of what type of divine abilities sovereigns could use. Not even the memories of the worldly Taoist had helped much in that regard. However, despite being shocked, he didn't retreat. After all, if he avoided this attack, the 9 vortexes would surely go after the fleeing eternal immortal domains. Eyes bloodshot, he thought, I only have one option. Fight. In the past, Bai Xiaochun feared death because he wanted to live forever. In the past, he didn't understand why there had to be things like fighting and killing. But that was the past. Although he still retained some of that past innocence in his heart, he had grown up. He was a sovereign now, and he knew that if he wanted to live forever, he could not allow himself to fear death. He knew that if he wanted to put an end to fighting and killing, then he had to be completely invincible. Eyes bloodshot, he faced the 9 vortexes and threw his hands out in front of him, causing his sovereign aura to blaze. Then, he performed a quick incantation gesture and spoke in a low voice. Former. Instantly, his sutra of former reincarnation appeared. The 9 vortexes, which contained power so destructive it could end the starry sky, suddenly shuddered as magical symbols began to pour out from them. The 9 vortexes really did come from sprawling worlds that the mortal renegade had brought nirvanic extermination to, worlds that had their own starry skies. Therefore, Bai Xiaochun's use of the Sutra of Former Reincarnation did not just dredge up the memories of living beings, but of entire starry skies. Although those starry skies of the past had been destroyed and transformed into statues, their memories still existed. The magical symbols became countless images of living things. There were men and women, old and young, even animals and other strange entities. They were howling in rage and resentment as they flew, not toward Bai Xiaochun, but toward the vortex from which they had come forth. The mortal renegade was visibly surprised, and yet, things weren't over yet. Bai Xiaochun could sense the sovereign power within himself ebbing, and yet, he still performed another incantation gesture. Present, the Sutra of Present Life and Death. Now that Bai Xiaochun was a sovereign, this divine ability was even more extraordinary. As soon as it appeared, the starry sky trembled, and an enormous, ancient gate appeared behind him. This time, it was not the gate of death, which was how he had used the technique in the past, but rather, the gate of life. And behind the vortexes appeared 9 gates, each of which was a gate of death. The Sutra of Present Life and Death could reverse life and death, but this time, instead of traveling from life into death, it was the opposite. Death to life, darkness to light. As the 9 vortex were attacked by the magical symbols, causing their very foundations to be deeply shaken, the auras of death that surrounded them began to dissipate. Even more shocking was that, as the auras of death disappeared, the air of nirvanic extermination faded, and it seemed as though life force would soon appear. It was as if they were reverting into the 9 great worlds they had once been in the past. At this point, the mortal renegade no longer looked surprised. Snorting coldly, he extended his right hand and performed an incantation gesture. Be destroyed, he said coolly. The 9 vortexes instantly destabilized and began to fall apart. Obviously, the mortal renegade realized how dangerous things could get if he let things proceed. After all, he wanted to kill Bai Xiaochun as quickly as possible. However, before the 9 vortexes could actually be destroyed, Bai Xiaochun looked at them with bloodshot eyes and shouted, "Future." Suddenly, a soul connection snapped into place, and something like an aura of karma could be sensed. And the target was the mortal renegade. Instantly, the 9 vortexes shattered, and the power of nirvanic extermination within them hurtled toward Bai Xiaochun with mountain-toppling, sea-draining force. That power seemed unstoppable, and was more than enough to slaughter a sovereign. However, Bai Xiaochun had already used his Sutra of the Former to weaken the vortexes. And the power of the gates of life and death had sapped their energy even further. Therefore, although they were still terrifyingly powerful, they were not enough to kill Bai Xiaochun. The magical symbols of the Sutra of the Former shattered, and the gates of life and death fell to pieces. Then, blood sprayed out of Bai Xiaochun's mouth as he was sent tumbling backward. At the same time, the power of the Sutra of the Future sent the same blow to the mortal renegade. Howling, the mortal renegade ignored the backlash injuries, sweeping his left hand out as if to grab Bai Xiaochun. As his hand passed through the void, the starry sky around it shattered. In that moment of crisis, Bai Xiaochun backed up, hands blurring with an incantation gesture that sent the essence of time out as gravitational extermination. This was Bai Xiaochun's first time using gravitational extermination as a sovereign. After taking control of 50% of the starry sky, and forming numerous Tao clones, his control over the essence of time had improved, and therefore, his gravitational extermination was far more powerful. Reaching out toward one particular direction of the starry sky, he made a grasping gesture. Time hourglass. In response, the hourglass region that he had discovered years ago suddenly trembled, and a Tao clone appeared there. Bai Xiaochun had prepared long ago to use the precious treasure if needed. Therefore, as soon as he called out to it, and his essence of time built up, the entire area trembled, and the region of countless hourglasses vanished. When it reappeared, it was in the exact location the eternal immortal domains had previously occupied in the starry sky. Now, a gigantic hourglass suddenly existed there. Bai Xiaochun had control over the essence of time, but did not have complete control over this hourglass. After all, he did not own it. Given enough time, he would have been able to refine it and make it his own, but there was no time for that now. Instead of using the full extent of its powers, he would use it, like a club, to beat his enemy. He would attack the mortal renegade with a magical item that had once belonged to the man's master. The instant the hourglass appeared, the mortal renegade's expression flickered. He recognized that hourglass, and knew that it was a precious treasure left behind by his master. Back when his master had perished, that hourglass had vanished without a trace. The mortal renegade had searched for it, but in vain. Eventually, he had assumed it lost for good. Therefore, to see Bai Xiaochun summon it right here in this fight was profoundly shocking. As the hourglass appeared, a vast array of hourglasses came into being around the mortal renegade, changing the flow of time and creating a sealing power. Clearly, Bai Xiaochun wanted to seal the mortal renegade. The mortal renegade closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and threw his hands wide, causing boundless black smoke to pour off of him. Within that smoke was death and nirvanic extermination, which immediately rushed toward the hourglasses. The hourglass had once belonged to his master, and had many extraordinary aspects. Although the mortal renegade was strong, he was not a master of the essence of time, and therefore, the smoke he unleashed was having a hard time suppressing the hourglasses. However, the power of the hourglasses was limited. Although they could keep the mortal renegade locked down temporarily, eventually, he would be able to break free. Bai Xiaochun had been aware of that from the beginning. Ignoring the mortal renegade, he closed his eyes and sent his divine sense out to touch the Tao clones that existed in the 50% of the starry sky that he controlled. Instantly, the Tao clones in hundreds of thousands of various ruins opened their eyes. Each of those clones was Bai Xiaochun, and could be controlled by him just like his true self. In fact, in many ways, they didn't even seem like clones. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.